Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and our talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to a little poem that's often anthologized. We commented on an earlier poem, Learned Astronomer, and anthologized. This one gets anthologized a lot for reasons I think we'll get into, called I Sit and Look Out. This is poem number 11 of the 29 of a collection called By the Roadside. Like Astronomer, I think this poem, there's good reasons for it to be anthologized. This is one of the more disturbing poems for a lot of readers of Leaves of Grass. O Mio Life, we will, of course, have already done just a few poems before. O Mio Life is often a companion read to this, and we'll ask about Whitman again in this, what I have used this phrase, a sustained theodicy in our big five again. Epistemology, what you can know; ontology, who you are; psychology, the study of the individual mind, motivations and the like, anxieties and the like; sociology, the flip side of sociology and or psychology; and then finally that question of theodicy. Why must there be pain and suffering in this world? And I think we're going to see some of that played out here in this poem, and maybe for some of you in very disturbing ways. Now the assumption for us is that you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net. Down the left-hand side, Talks with Walt is what we are calling our chats with the different poems of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. And the hope, and a number of you are reporting that you've purchased your copy of Leaves of Grass and you are annotating like crazy these poems. Our hope is that you've followed everything from inscriptions all the way up to and including an introduction to By the Roadside collection of poems. And then we just finished with President. Let's go ahead and turn now to Norton's for a few moments to get a sense of what's up with this poem. Leaves of Grass number 17, this one started out as Leaves of Grass number 17 in the 1860 edition. Number 5 in another group, so named in 1867. The poem's present title appeared in 1871, when it was also in a Leaves of Grass group. It was transferred in 1881 to By the Roadside. And in one manuscript collection, it has the title Leaf, with a dash after the word leaf. Now, I want you to remember that when we did Song of Myself, and I think there's a lot of Song of Myself in residuals from this, and one of the cool things about reading a poem like this, as I said about Astronomer, that are so anthologized, it's really fun to read a poem like this in its order after having studied all of the previous poems of Leaves of Grass. You know what I'm saying? It's like one thing to just pull a poem out of Leaves of Grass and just study it. It's another thing to have sat down from the very first word come and read everything right up to this moment, because obviously you're able to kind of say, wow, there's a lot of echoes, there's a lot of carryover, there's a lot of ways to look at this sustained theodicy as we've been talking about it. Let's now remind ourselves that in Song of Myself, passage 4, you'll remember a set of lines that we were constantly playing with when we did our series of poems from Song of Myself. He says in passage 4 of Song of Myself, both in and out of the game, watching and wondering at it, and then of course the last line of that section you'll remember is, I witness and wait. When we look at this poem, we are definitely playing the same game of witness and wait. He says it this way: I sit and look out upon all the sorrows of the world, and upon all the oppression and shame. I hear secret convulsive sobs from young men at anguish with themselves, remorseful after deeds done. I see in low life the mother misused by her children, dying, neglected, gaunt, desperate. I see the wife misused by her husband. I see the treacherous seducer of young women. I mark the ranklings of jealousy and unrequited love attempted to be hid. I see these sights on the earth. I see the workings of battle, pestilence, tyranny. I see martyrs and prisoners. I observe a famine at sea. I observe the sailors casting lots who shall be killed to preserve the lives of the rest. I observe the slights and degradations cast by arrogant persons upon laborers, the poor, and upon Negroes and the like. All the meanness and agony without end, I sitting look out upon, see, hear, and am silent. Now there's a lot of this poem that resonates with readers right up to the last 3 words. What? You look at all the pain and suffering of the world and you are silent. Of course, there's a bit of irony that here we have a poem, and so clearly he's not that silent. But we have a poem in which he argues that he's silent. Now, right away, let's point out the power of the 13 capital I's, right? The 13 I's of the poem. And there is a good argument that we're going to make it to be that there is a movement from the I to the we or the us in this poem. Let's just go through it now and pay attention to the power of a poem like this. It is an unsettling poem. It is an unsettling theodicy. That is to say, a response to the pain and suffering of humans. He says, I sit and look out upon, and this looking out obviously is a whole part of by the roadside, what are we looking at and the like. I sit and look out. By the way, notice it is sitting as well. Much has been made of the fact that Whitman paid a lot of attention to the Gospels, and especially to Matthew, and especially to the Sermon on the Mount, where we're told that the teacher Christ sits down. Much has been made by theologians of this. And notice here, we're going to be sitting. In other words, it's kind of passive. Notice we're not out walking among the city as we have seen in some other poems, but here we got this very reflective and observing Whitman, or speaker of the poem, if it's not Whitman. I sit and look out upon all the, sorrows of the world. Notice back to O me, O life, it's the O me, so sad, reoccurring. The sorrows of the world, and upon all the oppression and shame. Whitman hasn't shied away. This is why I argue that Whitman is not a just blind optimist. Whitman is the first to point out the world's got some really, really wretched bad stuff that happens. By the way, notice the word shame in the way that it gets used here. In the next line, I hear secret, and later it will be hid, right? Secret convulsive sobs from young men at anguish. By the way, this use of the word sobs will take us back to the poem Tears, with sobbing tears. Sobs from, notice we've got men and women here, and especially young men and women. Young men at anguish with themselves. Are we talking about Whitman himself here? Remorseful after deeds done. We've seen this already presented several times in Leaves of Grass, right? And again, it's interesting what exactly it is that Whitman might be referencing. Harold Bloom said that this had something to do with the guilt and shame that Whitman felt either about his homoerotic tendencies or his homosexual tendencies. I see, back again, notice I hear, I sit, I look, I hear, now it's I see. I see in low life. By low here, what do we mean? Probably poverty to some degree. The mother, and then a compelling image, misused by her children, dying, neglected, gaunt, desperate. Of course, we got to think about Whitman as person in his relationship with his mother, whom he at times almost deified. I see the wife, so notice we'll continue now with women, misused. Of course, we got misused by the children misusing the mother. Now we're a wife misused by her husband. Now, this is powerful. Whitman is going to call out domestic abuse long before lots of other people were willing to do it, right? I see the treacherous seducer of young women. You'll remember in To a Prostitute, he's playing similar kinds of games the way prostitutes can maybe be laughed at, and he's defending. So notice here, the young woman who is seduced. And then I mark, as in pay attention to, the ranklings of jealousy and unrequited love attempted to be hid. Notice it's attempted to be hid. In other words, it's probably something that's going to get out. I see these sights, and then on the earth. And it takes us back, of course, to the biblical Ecclesiastes under the sun. In other words, all this pain, all these terrible things. And notice that a lot of this is, this isn't pain like being caught in a hurricane or something out at sea in a storm and people die. No, this is human-inflicted pain. Almost seems to be at times intentionally human-inflicted pain on the earth. Then he shifts from that more personal imagery to then larger sociological imagery. I see the workings of battle. We're going to get ready for drum taps. I think there's a reason why these poems sit right before drum taps. Pestilence, tyranny. I see martyrs and prisoners. There's 5 of those things that he lists, right? And then in what some have said, is the single most compelling single image, disturbing image in all of Leaves of Grass. I observe a famine at sea, and your first instincts are, what famine at sea? Oh yeah. What happens if they hit the doldrums? We think, of course, of Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. What happens if they hit the doldrums and then all of a sudden they run out of food? I observe a famine at sea, and then he repeats observe. I observe the sailors casting lots, And we obviously will think of the story of Christ and the casting of lots, right? Who shall be killed, the elided verb, killed to preserve the lives of the rest. It's an amazing image. And a number of scholars have pointed out, this is in some ways preparing us for our reading of drum taps. And again, that's the same theodicy. There had to be a war. It's the Gettysburg Address of Lincoln. There had to be a war. And why? Well, sacrifice was necessary for the greater good, the rest of us. In other words, we're going to kill a soldier so we have something to eat on the boat. Wow. Or kill a Marine or somebody who's on the ship, right? We're going to kill so that we can preserve the lives of the rest. It's an interesting moral quandary, right? It's a horrific idea. I observe, notice now for the third time, I observe the slights and degradations cast by arrogant persons. You'll remember that Song of Myself 40 uses arrogant republics. Upon laborers, the poor, and upon Negroes. 2 times this word gets used in our old theologian. I commented on it then. And the way in which he finishes with the and the like. In other words, there are individuals who think themselves so much better. I observe all of this. And of course, the abolitionist movement was ready to point out that Whitman was ready to say this. But then, of course, we get to the last line and we're like, wait a minute, what's going on? All these, and then the dash, and again the use of the word all the meanness and agony without end. Of course, the meanness was used in O mio life, objects mean. And then, of course, the endless trains of that same poem. Without end, I, sitting, look out upon. Notice the construction is interesting to end with the preposition, right? And I sit and I look out. It's as if I'm looking at the world. And of course, when film started to become a greater part of America, many looked at this as almost like Whitman's watching a movie, like he's watching, we would say today, of course, watching video clips on YouTube or whatever, to just see all of the terrible, horrific suffering that is happening in the world. He says this, I see, I hear, and then, you know, it's going to challenge us with, I am silent. Wait, what? Now, of course, this immediately would take readers of Whitman's day to Shakespeare and the Hamlet final line, the rest is silence. You'll remember that in Me and Perturb, you have passive silent as they, which is getting us ready for this. You will remember that in Song of Myself, number 3, says, I am silent, I go bathe, and I, he says, will look at myself, right? And so we're having this game being played. What is up with this poem in terms of, okay, I see all the pain in the world and I'm silent. Now many have seen this as Whitman's pessimism, his unwillingness to accept that there's anything that can be done in the face of a lot of senseless pain and suffering in the world. Others have said that what Whitman is trying to point out is that you can't often change the pain and suffering in the world. In other words, Whitman is no utopian. Whitman is no individual that says, if only we could have X, we would never have any pain or suffering. We wouldn't have these issues in the world. Now, of course, reformers have looked at this poem and said, this is pretty sad of Whitman. I mean, why doesn't he call himself to get up from sitting and go do something about the pain and suffering of the world? And that leads us, obviously, to some of the messages of the poem. That is to say, the pain and the suffering of this world is real. It's not that he's saying it doesn't matter, clearly, right? But it's often hard to know how to respond, what to do. Now, of course, there's a bit of irony in 2b. Notice that we move from the I of this poem to easily become the we or the us of the poem. You've got 13 times the word I gets used here. But in the end, really, it's almost like the reader will take on this persona of the I, because we all have seen terrible things. We know that terrible things happen in this world of man-made or human-made pain and suffering. And it's like, what do you do with all that pain? And of course the irony is that Whitman is writing Leaves of Grass. There's a good argument to be said that when Whitman says that I'm silent, what he's really meaning is I am contemplative, I'm thinking, I'm trying to figure out, what do I do about all this pain? I know what I'll do. I'll write a poem about it. I'll write a bunch of poems about it, and I'll keep editing those poems, and I'm going to call that Leaves of Grass. That will be my contribution to the powerful play as we go back to O Mio Life. I think O Mio Life has got to be read, and I think that's why he put it the way he put it. I think it's got to be read in companion with this poem. At 3a, there's so many different texts. I mean, Shirley Jackson's The Lottery for us comes to mind immediately, this idea of speculating on pain and suffering and what to do about it. O Mio Life, obviously, we've shared. I want to comment, though, on two other writers. Dante's Divine Comedy, I think, works very well, and I'm certain that Whitman had in his mind this idea. Notice that Virgil will point out constantly to Dante the Pilgrim, you're getting way emotional about these people being in these situations in hell, but you need to understand they chose this. In their life, they chose. In other words, they make their own hell. And we've given full lectures on these lines at learnstrong.net. We've talked at length about, especially Dante's Inferno. You can go run those to ground. But I think there's reason for Whitman to have borrowed from Dante. I also want to think about Swift's modest proposal. That is to say, we have all these children nobody wants. Let's just eat them before the age of 1, which is, of course, a horrible, horrible idea. I mean, what are you serious? Of course, this is satire, and Swift isn't serious. At least we hope he's not serious. But what he's really saying is, there are these moral quandaries. What are you going to do with all these children that nobody wants? I mean, which is worse, to eat a child before the age of 1, or to let the child grow up and in complete deprivation and degradation, and then to be terribly abused? I mean, which is worse? Well, obviously we're not going to eat children, so ergo, we got to fix this problem. And I think we've got some of that moral dilemma stuff happening in this poem as well. In other words, there's different ways to understand the pain of the world, and there's different ways to be responsive to it, right? Finally, at 3b, well, this is an interesting poem, and I know that it's going to challenge some of us who will have to take a long walk and kind of think about it. What can be done, do you think, to alleviate the suffering and the pain of the world? I mean, really, what can you do? What have you done to try to respond to the pain and suffering in the world? Is it true that the best way to respond is to try to take care of your own pain and your own suffering and anguish first? That is to say, to take care of yourself first before you can start to help others and the pain and suffering? Or is that just a cop-out that says, well, you could spend your whole life just worrying about yourself, and that's kind of a political narcissism that I just don't accept at all? It's an interesting idea. In other words, the theodicy question comes back. To ask, why is this happening to me, is probably not a very useful question. Why is this happening for me might demand some kind of action. And obviously, the question is, what kind of action, what kind of contribution? I hope this poem is challenging you. Thank you.